My name is Mickey Bergman. I have spent over 17 years negotiating with some of the world's most hostile regimes on behalf of families in the United States. This is everything I'm authorized to tell you. Hostage situations are actually not as rare as people think they are. At any given point, there are between 50 and 70 Americans that are wrongfully detained or taken hostage. There are typically tens or even hundreds more that are in gray situations. Time is the worst enemy for the prisoners themselves. At any given point, a disease or a violent act in the prison can take place. And I've been in this long enough to have experienced those. The Russians are extremely sophisticated. And it feels every time I meet with them on a negotiation mission, I step up and I come with a plan and I deliver the plan, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I always leave with a feeling, boy, they knew exactly what I was going to do. They had several steps ahead of me on the play, and they were moving at their pace in the direction that they wanted. In terms of the negotiations and diplomacy, they're old school. We would step into a meeting and they would know who we are, what we said before, what our tactics are, and they'll be prepared with what they want. When we first reached out to the Russians when Paul Whelan was taken, and we came up with the idea, we wanted to say, hey, before we talk about releases, let's talk about a humanitarian gesture. Get him a medical exam out of the prison. We thought we're brilliant with this idea, baby step. And the ambassador looked at us like, well, it's funny you're coming complaining about the humanitarian and lack of medical treatment of your guy when we have this Russian prisoner, in this case it was a guy named Konstantin Yaroshenko, held in Connecticut, and he's been begging to see a dentist and he hasn't been able to see one for all this time. And I was like, oh, look, we would be happy to look into it. And maybe by proving to you that we can get him the attention, you can also do that. And the ambassador would say, well, we believe in reciprocity. But he had printed in advance all of the details of Konstantin Yaroshenko and the letters that he asked our US government for the dentist. He didn't ask for it in the meeting to be printed. He had it printed before. I knew he was leading that conversation. He had it played out. And that was my first encounter with him. And I've learned from that. One of the hardest things in these negotiations is to really assess who it is that you're meeting with. It's easier when it's a leader, because there's a lot of material out there. It's harder when it's a staffer or a mid-level official. Part of it takes time. It's repeat meetings, it's repeat engagements. Governor Bill Richardson of New Mexico used to joke around that he loves working with dictatorships for two reasons. One, you only need to convince one person. You don't need, like a democracy, you have to run it by parliament and all that. And second, they stick around for a long time. And negotiations, I believe, rely a lot on personality. I try to avoid reading what other people say about an individual. I try to listen primary material, speeches, interviews. Sometimes the content matters less than the tone and the things you can pick up on somebody's personality. I know I can't bluff. I know I can't lie. I use it to my advantage. I actually lead with my vulnerability. I don't need to go and sit in front of somebody, a leader or somebody, and say, oh no, but I'm genuine. It comes very clearly through the stories you share and the way you speak. I would never go and sit in front of a captor and say, the man you're holding is innocent. So I show a lot of respect to their judicial system, and I try to find ways in which I want to bring the person home and what are the conditions for it. I'm not there to win a punching game. I'm there to get somebody home. It is never a one-time game. It's always a repeat game. You would think, oh yeah, I got the person out, that's it, I'm done. But tomorrow there'll be another one. Or next year there'll be another one. And so it's always important in every negotiation, even if you can squeeze more, to be very reasonable to the extent that you know that your counterpart appreciates it. Because they know when you have leverage and you know when they do. And if you maximize on your negotiations at a certain moment, guess what? Next time, when you don't have the leverage, they will squeeze the living hell out of you. Being a bully works really well with bullies, which is why President Trump is doing relatively well with the bullies of the world. He knows how to communicate, he knows how to talk, and he gets what he wants. Now, you can agree, disagree if what he wants is what is needed, but that's besides the point. This is not political. It's just a negotiation style. The Biden administration worked really well with our allies who are not bullies, but did poorly with the bullies of the world. There are many types of hostage negotiators. There are the government officials who negotiate on behalf of the governments. And there are what we refer to as third parties, which includes myself. I do not receive funds from the US government. We actually do not receive funds from any government, even foreign government. We work on behalf of the families of those who are being taken. We work at their request only. We raise our money from donations from private people and businesses in the United States. Sometimes when Americans are taken, at the beginning, nobody knows who has them and why. And you need to activate a network in order to figure out how to locate them. Because we're private, we're able to throw in quick money in order to buy data services to help triangulate and find somebody, and then we share that with the authorities so they know. Because the fastest we know who has somebody, the fastest we can come up with how they can come back home. When we actually negotiate with captors, when we're in these countries, in most of those countries, civil society is not independent. So it's hard for him to comprehend the fact that we indeed don't work for the government. We don't pay ransom. That's illegal in the United States, and we don't do anything that breaks the law in the United States. When the governments deal with these things, there's a saying, we never make concessions. Well, we make concessions. Let's grow up. They're calculated concessions, and we can take them back after we get our people home as well, because the people that you make the deal with are not exactly reputable people most of the time. In the case of the release of Americans out of Iran, there was a big part of it that was very criticized a few years ago, that there was a huge amount of money of Iranian frozen assets that were held in South Korea that were unfrozen following that deal. It became a political punching bag in the United States. Look at that. You bought their freedom. Easy to punch politically. But for people who understand the details behind it, the money was not American money. It wasn't American taxpayers' money. It's Iranian money that was frozen under American orders in South Korea. More than that, it was money that the South Koreans were not going to be able to keep holding because it didn't fit within their legal system as well. The Iranians sued on this, and we knew that there's going to be released. You can argue that the United States actually used money that was going to be released anyway as leverage in order to get Americans home. Money is very fungible. There will be an American that needs to come home, and that American will end up coming home, and it will appear that nothing was given in return, but the host country gets an aid package a few months later that helps them. Now, people can claim cynically and say, oh, look at that. That was the ransom for... It's like, yeah, but is it a ransom if it actually is paid to do good in the country and help a society? When an American gets taken for the family, this comes to them out of left field. Every single decision they make might be the decision that will gain the freedom of their loved one, or will cost them a month, a year, or their lives. And that burden is unbearable. We never proactively go to families. The first call that they make is either to the Department of State or to their congressional representative. The representatives at this point know enough, a lot of them know enough to say, okay, here are the entities in the government that you need to reach. There's a special presidential envoy and hostage affairs office at State Department, or there's a hostage recovery fusion cell at the FBI. But there's also people outside of government that you might want to start reaching out to. So the families approach us. Sometimes we're able to collaborate with the US government. Sometimes we butt heads with them. A lot of Americans, when they hear those stories every now and then in the news, their assumption is that the Americans have done something wrong. And truth is, in some cases, they have done something wrong that puts them into the system. So they're getting arrested or they're getting held. They get treated differently because they're Americans. And so you will get on tiny little violations of something unintentional, being drunk, for example, you end up with 8.5 years in prison. You know that turned into a wrongful detention. Once we accept the case, we come up with a theory of return. The pathway, the quickest way we think somebody can come home. Building a strategy based on that theory of return, and then engaging directly with the captors, creating the narrative in the US media if needed, and engaging with the US government in order to make sure that all the pieces come together that brings the American back home. The government's instinct is to tell a family, don't say anything, don't make a big splash over it, because that will just increase the price for your loved one. 90% of the time it is not correct. By the time the captive government or the captors have the individual, they know exactly who they have, and they know exactly how important it can be or not be and how to play that. The media is a tool. The captors don't care about what the family says. They care what the US government says. So all media engagement by families is directed at one audience, and that is the White House. And it's either direct or it's indirect by creating a groundswell of support publicly that will then shift the White House. A big part of our work is also to maintain and grow the relationships with our own government. And those relationships are always complex. They change in politics. Is it a Republican administration, a Democratic administration? There's different approaches. The people change inside the administration all the time. When there is a potential deal on the table, and we know when there is because we work it, that's when you put the actual pressure and saying, okay, decision time. There's an opportunity to bring somebody home. And sometimes we would go to our government and say, look, there is a deal. Now we're going to give you a month to do it, and you will take credit and we will sit in the back on this and not say anything. But if you don't do it in a month, remember, we don't work for you, we work for the family. And America will need to know that there is a very reasonable deal here that you refuse to do, and you're keeping an American in prison because of that. So that's kind of the calculations that go into the media exposure. What made Brittney Griner's case unique was her stature. At that point when she was taken, she was the highest profile political prisoner / hostage, however we want to call it, that has been taken. Even though I know the story publicly that has been out there is that she actually tried to smuggle drugs. She didn't. She did use drugs, she admitted to that, and so that was much more of an entrapment. The average time it takes for somebody to come home is about 2.5 years. That's a very long time. We had some successes of much shorter time, and recently it's been getting shorter. But with Brittney, we knew that because of all this constituency and the war in Ukraine, that this might play out much, much faster. Brittney got a lot of hate, and balancing that was very difficult because we would get, Governor Richardson was a public figure, and we will be in New York, as was publicly known that we're negotiating and working on this. And we would get people come to us, make sure, forget about that basketball player, make sure you bring Paul Whelan home. And we're like, yeah, we're working on bringing them both home. Like, no, forget about her. Like a lot of things that are very hard to hear. And you can imagine how hard it is for her family to hear as well. Brittney Griner, her agent Lindsay Collis, they knew how to build up the constituency, the NBA, the WNBA, but they only unleashed them when the time was right, when there was a potential deal on the table. Brittney also elevated this whole field in a way that we never had before, in a way that there's public attention to it. And she continued to do that after she returned. And every time she would have an encounter, she knew she's going to meet the president in the White House Correspondents' Dinner or anything else. She would send a note through her agent to me and say, hey, I think I'm going to have a pull aside with the president. Give me 2 talking points that can help a family in need right now. And we would come up with those and she would deliver them. And I can tell you, at least in one case, she had made the president pay attention to a case that we couldn't get his attention on, that resolved in the person coming home. When Brittney Griner came home and the deal was to release Victor Bout, who's an arms dealer, that was a tough one. From a justice perspective, an innocent basketball player for an arms dealer who's responsible for the death of a lot of people. It's not just. Before there was Brittney Griner and before there was Trevor Reed, there was only Paul Whelan. The Russians suggested to us at some point that they'll give us Paul Whelan back if Victor Bout comes home. Yeah, we can go to the White House and say, yeah, release Victor Bout for Paul Whelan, but we won't win on that one. We can't convince them, we can't convince ourselves. The deals never get better in time. They only get worse, or if we're lucky, they don't change. So when Victor Bout was a non-starter for the United States in return for Paul Whelan, after a couple of years, guess what? We traded him for Brittney Griner. The deal got worse. Danny Fenster, he's a journalist from Detroit, and he was working in Myanmar. He was detained. They found that a publication that he used to work for has become illegal after the military takeover. He was held in Myanmar for a total of 6 months, from May until November, when we went over and picked him up. The charges against him were not justified. That's not what we argued. For his return, it was much more of a personal relationship that we built with the leader, with the general, between Governor Richardson and him, that ended up as a personal favor and a gesture to the governor to let him out. It took us 2 trips over there in the middle of the pandemic. Danny's arrest is a great example of how a lot of these cases happen with Americans being detained. It wasn't a targeted arrest. It wasn't an order by the leadership to arrest him. He wasn't anybody of importance. They found out that he used to work for this publication. They started finding things of him criticizing the military. There was a lot of things under a military rule that you can apply as violations of the law. And then, of course, added the fact that the United States government did not recognize the military government of Myanmar, and that was a way of forcing engagement. In trying to get Danny Fenster home, interestingly enough, one of the biggest obstacles for us was our interaction with our own government. We knew that the way to get Danny home is for us to go physically to Myanmar, meet with the leader, and convince him to let Danny go. And we worked really well with the State Department until we managed to get the invitation to go to Myanmar. And then the State Department turned on us. And they said, please don't go. We have good reasons to believe that it's going to be resolved. So of course we didn't go, because the last thing we want to do is trip over something that is ongoing, and we don't have security clearance, so, it's fine for the government. We trust them if they tell us there's something going on. So we did that. We waited. And so eventually we had a conversation between the governor, myself, and the Deputy Secretary of State at the time, where the governor reminded her, we're private citizens, we're going. And we held for 2 months for you, but you have it wrong. And she acknowledged that we could go, but she also made a request from us when we were there not to raise Danny Fenster. And to my surprise, Governor Richardson's response was, we will not raise Danny Fenster when we're there. And then he looked at me and he says, Mickey, remember, we don't work for the government. We work for the family. Go get me a mandate from the family to go on that trip. And I called Brian Fenster, who's Danny's brother, who was my point of contact with the family. And then I said, but Brian, if we have an opportunity to bring Danny home, we shouldn't leave him behind, right? And I was laughing and he was laughing. He's like, no, please, Mickey, if you can bring him home, please don't leave him behind. I disconnected the phone. I had my mandate. If we had an opportunity to bring him home, we were to raise it and bring him home. And that's what we did. When Paul Whelan was taken, he was the first one in that new age of hostage diplomacy or prisoner diplomacy between the US and Russia. Many things about his case were unclear. When we looked into it and when Elizabeth Whelan, Paul's sister, reached out and we talked about, to us, it was very clear. especially when we engaged with the Russians, we knew exactly what the Russians wanted. If the captors are asking for something from the US government, then it doesn't matter what the person did or did not do, they're a political prisoner at that point. With every single step forward on Paul Whelan, it felt like circumstances and the US government decisions let him stay behind. When we first negotiated with the Russians, they asked for Viktor Bout, we laughed that off. They then said, oh, Konstantin Yaroshenko for Paul Whelan. Konstantin Yaroshenko was a Russian drug pilot that was caught in West Africa and was extradited to the US. Sounds like not too much of a painful thing, but the US government did not do it. Then they took Trevor Reed, the Russians. And then when we went to negotiate with them, Trevor Reed was sick. He was coughing blood. We thought it was an infection. In a Russian prison during the pandemic, an infection is not necessarily a good thing. We came back from Russia with a proposal to do 2 for 2. But the US government decided to do only Trevor Reed for Konstantin Yaroshenko. So the same guy that could have been released for Paul Whelan 2 years before was now being released for Trevor Reed, and Paul Whelan stayed behind. And then we went back to Russia to negotiate on Paul Whelan and Brittney Griner. It was 2 for 2 from the Russians. Viktor Bout and Vinnik for Griner and Paul Whelan. And we brought that back. And this time, we didn't want to hear about a 1 for 1 because we couldn't let Paul Whelan stay behind again. And we conveyed that to the White House. Really, I believe they genuinely tried to do the 2 for 2. Somehow they couldn't communicate on the formal channel with the Russians to get that done. And time was ticking. And they realized, well, we can get Brittney Griner for Viktor Bout, and then we'll do Paul Whelan after. And so that's what they did. Not our choice, but that's what they did. And that was extremely painful for the Whelan family. It was extremely painful for Paul himself. And it took a long time after that in order to get the deal that actually brought him back home. The uniqueness of Paul was that he was left behind, in my count, at least 4 times. The deal that brought Paul Whelan back home was lots of moving parts, lots of exchanges. I know people like to criticize the work that we do and the deals that we make as saying, oh, if you negotiate, you incentivize taking more Americans. Well, Russia is a great example of when you refuse to negotiate, you also increase the motivation to take more Americans. There's about 3 to 5 new cases average every week that come to us with families asking for help. Doesn't mean that we take them, but we need to do our own due diligence because there's a lot of cases that there are Americans that have committed a crime, and we're not in the business of getting criminals out of prison. We defined it as 3 different categories. The first one is an American that did nothing wrong but was entrapped in order to solicit something as a concession from the US government. Number 2 are the cases of Americans that have done something wrong, and the treatment of the American is different than any local doing the same crime. The third category is one in which Americans actually did something wrong in a country, or that we cannot argue that they didn't. They're treated more or less equally to a local that would have done the same thing. However, their condition of their detainment and their physical well-being is at high risk. So these are not people who are wrongfully detained, but they're still people that we will try and help because their terms of being held are subhuman or far away from the US standard of what an American should be treated like. It is true that we need to work on deterrence. It is true that we need to come up with the policies that will prevent or mitigate the risk of Americans being taken. But it is morally corrupt to try and do that deterrence on the backs of Americans that are being held already. I think when people think about hostage negotiations, especially internationally, when you go into the countries that are holding Americans, there is an immediate reaction, oh my God, they're holding Americans already, why are you going there? It's risky. And it's true, and there is a risk to it. There are ways for us to mitigate that risk, but we only go to these countries at the invitation of leadership. And we work really hard to get that invitation. And for that government, the government that holds the Americans, that invites us to come over, we're actually an asset for them. Because these are governments that typically have Either they don't communicate with the US at all, or the communications with the US is very troubled. And we're a channel. So they're not incentivized to take us. We're completely at their mercy. We don't have security with us. But the motivation is one in which we're assets of them. If we turn into a liability, yes, it's much, much riskier. There are countries and situations where we would decide not to go. I can tell you that right now, for example, when we negotiate with the Russians or meet with the Russians, I prefer doing it in a third country. There are countries that I can't go because of my place of birth from Israel. But in general, I think it's not that it's not risky of us being detained, but if we're responsible, we can mitigate that risk to some extent. A lot of the countries that I travel to would be considered for most Americans as dangerous countries. Russia, especially since the war started, Venezuela, Myanmar, North Korea, all of these, Sudan. When I think of going on a mission, and you have to assume that something bad might happen. And when you play that out in your head in advance and you say, okay, if something bad happens, the seconds before I either get arrested or my head gets cut off, do I know who's doing it and why? If I know the answer to those two questions of who and why, then I can mitigate the risk. If I don't know the answer, then I can't go. So there are places that I absolutely cannot go. I cannot go to Iran. Because in Iran, even if the president invites us, and we did get an invitation in the past to go, the president doesn't control the borders. There is a Revolutionary Guard that answers to somebody else. And so at the moment that something bad happens, you don't know who's doing it to you and why. And if you don't have an answer to those questions, you can't mitigate it. So when I negotiate with the Iranians, we do that in a third country. And I don't lie about my background. I don't necessarily go with a sign. Any leadership or any officers of foreign country before they meet, they do their homework. So they know. And I do have some public profile of things. When I traveled to Pyongyang in North Korea, I had my friends ask me, like, aren't you scared? It's so risky, there's nothing you can do to help us. And I laughed and I said, actually, North Korea was one of the places that I actually felt most comfortable with traveling. Because in North Korea, they hated me because I was American, not because I was Israeli or Jewish. Our role ends when the person comes home. Often, I never meet the prisoner. I meet their families, I know their families, I stay in touch with their families, but the prisoner never knows who did what for them. They were in prison. There are elements that we don't do. For example, while a family is handling a case where the loved one is home, there's multiple issues and things that they need to handle. Sometimes the person being held is the one that was the provider for the family. They need psychological help. They need social help. They need financial. They need legal help. We partner with organizations like Hostage US, and they also help the prisoner when they come home. There's a lot of elements of this work that is very emotionally taxing. There is an unpredictability in my travel. Early in the pandemic, before the vaccines, we had to go to Venezuela. We just had to, because there was negotiations over there that we had to do. The pandemic added a risk factor for all of our prisoners over there. And my wife and I had a huge argument over this. Again, not vaccinated, we had our masks and everything, but she was right about the risk. So the unpredictability of the work, the danger that is involved in this, as you can imagine, it takes a huge toll on the family. And I figured out all I can do with this is the best I can in every given moment. There are moments where my daughter asks me, why do I have to do this? But throughout her life and throughout her years from very early age, when I started talking to her about my work when she was 4, she has met many of the families. She has met many of the prisoners that returned. And she understands. A big part of this work is the conversations and dialogue and communications with the family of the captors. And the same way that I deploy empathy towards the captors or our own government or the different stakeholders in the negotiation, I deploy empathy with the families. In fact, for me personally, that's my motivation. So after a family call or before a mission, you know what the stakes are. I need an outlet. And I found, and this is just of recent years, I found that running really helps me. That helps me regulate my emotions in this a lot. There's a joke, when people see a comment on people who are running long distances, say, oh, they must be running from something. It's like, that's exactly right. I know that negotiations are a repeat game. And I know that my relationships, in order for me to be successful, I need to maintain those relationships. So I'm very careful on how I speak about people. I'm genuine, because again, I can't bluff. I don't have a lying face. Of late, we have seen that the taking of Americans by foreign governments is less played in the legal part of it. They used to have a case against them. It used to be important to present this person did X and put a trial. Of late, we're even skipping that. People are just being detained. There's no charges really pending trial, all these things, because it's so clearly now a transactional thing. But that correlates with the way the United States government is also dealing with it. If we're a transactional government, the response to us will be transactional as well. So I do think this is going to continue. I hope it's going to start winding down in numbers. And I think that the massive return that we've seen since January of Americans, I think it will continue throughout this year. And I hope that we will also see a decrease in the number of Americans that are being taken. I think hostage taking or political prisoner taking, wrongfully detained taking, it runs certain waves in certain countries. Historically speaking, it's been a tool of diplomacy by certain countries for decades. Iran has always been using that as a diplomatic tool for them. But there was a period around 2013 and 2015 when hostage taking became headlines in the United States because of ISIS. Because they took Americans, there were no negotiations over there. Since then, we have seen, since the demise of ISIS or their downfall, for at least for now, hopefully forever, we've seen much more of state-sponsored hostage taking, which is political prisoners and wrongfully detained. And we have repeat offenders, states that have become regular at doing it. Iran, historically, Russia, increasingly, China. And in each of them, it's different reasons. With China, it's a lot of exit bans and a lot of dual citizens, even though according to Chinese law, they're not dual citizens because as soon as they become an American, they forfeit the citizenship. But these are repeat offenders that we have. And the dynamics with them, with Russia, it's a part of the war and it's a part of the exchanges of agents. With Venezuela, it's a part of the lack of bilateral negotiations and relationship that they want to work through. And that's a way to motivate the Americans to engage. But there are other countries that it just happens randomly. North Korea, by the way, is an example of a country that used to be a repeat offender. But since Otto Warmbier and the results of Otto Warmbier when he came back in his death, they decided they don't want to play in this anymore. They realized it doesn't work out for them very well. Of late, most commonly, we see a lot of the exchanges. You can't get there without the personal gestures, without the personal relationships. The photo ops play a big role. The legitimacy that comes through those photo ops. So if Governor Richards and I traveled to Myanmar and had pictures with the leader, and the leader used it domestically so look at that, international leaders, we're not a government. We don't legitimize or don't legitimize people. If that's what he needed out of it, I'll be paying that price any day if I save an American life with it. I'm okay with that. My conscience is very clear with that. Once somebody is back home, where we fail is to debrief with that person, learn about everybody who has wronged that person, from the prison guards to the judges to the people in charge of the justice thing, and find ways to impose costs on those in a way to mitigate the risk that even if American is taken, the guards will treat them differently because there's a risk to them personally. Technology and social media and the ability to consume information is both, it's a tool, it's both for positive, but it's also negative with the way the captors are using it to demonize the person that they have. I can tell you a funny story that during the pandemic, we couldn't travel so much. So unless it was essential negotiations like we had with Venezuela, we would do a lot in alternative matters. So they would text a lot. And that's when I realized, because negotiating over text is very different than in person, you can't do complex and nuanced questions. You have to break everything down to tiny little pieces. And that's when I learned the power, and I know this will sound weird and funny, the power of emojis. Because tone doesn't go through text. But if you couple it with emoji, you can create a layer, an emotional layer to it, so the person receiving can understand better the tone in which you're saying something. And I can tell you that the Venezuelans are really good at that. So we have a whole back and forth on WhatsApp negotiations during the pandemic with a lot of emojis. Smiley face, flower, sun, like all these different things, which is just somebody will need to write a book at some point. But there is never, and I don't think there will be ever a replacement as good as in person. I was born in Israel. My accent doesn't lie. I tried to hide it for 25 years, couldn't. I came to the United States. I did my undergrad at UCLA. I did my graduate degree at Georgetown University, School of Foreign Service. And I always thought that my career will be foreign policy, probably Israeli-Arab conflict. But my first job out of Georgetown was with the Clinton Global Initiative. And part of my job was to talk to heads of corporations and foundations, because the former president, he wanted everybody to make a personal commitment to solving one of the world's challenges. Part of my job was to call those people and solicit those commitments. And I figured out, well, if I'm asking all these people to make commitments, I should make one myself. There was a genocide taking place in Sudan. And so I committed that after the inaugural conference of the Clinton Global Initiative in 2005, I will travel myself to Chad and go to the border between Chad and Sudan, interview some refugees for 2 weeks, and then come back and raise money for whatever I found that they need most. And so I sit at my office on a Wednesday and I get a phone call. And on the other side, there's this like rough voice and it's like, "Is this Mickey Bergman?" I said, "Yeah." It's like, "This is Governor Bill Richardson of New Mexico. I need you to pack your stuff and get your ass to Santa Fe. You're coming with me to Khartoum." And I had exactly 48 hours to try and figure out whether this is an opportunity of a lifetime or the stupidest mistake I do before my head gets separated from my body. I was not yet an American citizen. I was an Israeli former officer. Sudan and Israel are at war. So going there is a risk. And the consensus was that I'm going to fly to Santa Fe, have lunch with the governor, and then talk to him and explain to him that I don't want to risk the mission, explain the background, and then bow out nicely from the trip. And he just, he looked at me, he's like, no, Mickey. I told the Sudanese that I know you, I vouch for you. I told them that I know you for 6 years. If they have a problem with you, they have a problem with me, and we're all leaving. They're not separating us. Do you know what I'm famous for? I said, "What is that, Governor?" He says, "I get people out of jail. So worst comes to worst, you spend a couple of months in the Sudanese prison. Think what it will do to your career." And that trip blew my mind. I thought I would do Middle East in my life, but the world was much bigger and exciting. And the Clinton Global Initiative also showed me that it's not only governments who can do this work, but businesses can do it, and individuals and private sector. Because of my upbringing and because I served for 6 years in the Israeli Defense Force, I understand this sense of loss. I understand the ramifications of violence. I'm one of those who came out of a military service in combat with a very, very clear conviction that violence never solves our problems.
Hi, I'm a producer on Authorized Account. If you like this episode, then you should check out our new podcast and comment below with the names of people you'd love to hear us interview.